It is that time now once again, for getting lumped up with my friends. It's RockerMike and Rob that you should know, and you'll find them here on the Rock Show. Ooh, yeah, on the Rock Show.
Hello, people, and welcome to a wonderful show called The Rock Show. And today we got episode 147. We're almost going to reach 150 soon. And we got RockerMike, and today we're going to talk about a Queens band called the Fleshtones.
Yeah, Rob, how are you today? Good?
Pretty good, man, yeah.
All right. Yeah, good. Yeah, the Fleshtones. This was a fan-requested show, okay, the first of 4. We're going to do 2 in January and 2 in March. And I'd like to just give a shout out to Michael Sawaya, who is a good friend on Facebook, nice guy. And he suggested this. And it's one of these, well, you know, you met Mike that time at St. Patrick's Day a couple years ago when he came down.
Oh, yeah. And everybody, Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year. First show back into 2022. Can't believe we made it through another COVID year. 2021 is over. Yeah. Thank God. Let's hope things get better. But this is the first of 4 fan requested shows. So I want to thank everybody that put in requests. I considered everything. I went through what I thought was the best of them, and some of them that I thought were really good, I may revisit later in the year and just, tag them on as a regular rock show. So anyway, the Fleshtones was Michael Sawaya's request, so shout out to him. They're one of these bands that have been around for 45 years. Okay, they got their start at CBGB's in the mid-'70s, about 76. And they're really a story of determination and really just persevering. And it's amazing because they never really made it. No. They came close a couple of times in the 80s. I'll explain what they were involved with. But they were also kind of never really accepted in the CBGB scene. They came kind of on the heels. They
weren't really punk. They were rock and roll.
They were like a garage rock band. Okay, like a 60s, yes. Like a 60s garage rock band.
Yeah.
But they had elements of punk in them. The reason they started was because of the Ramones. Okay, so, but they took it to a little bit more of a traditional rock and roll party band, yes. Kind of thing. But they had a little twist to them, which I always thought was cool. Sometimes a little bit of a horror vibe, a little bit of a Cramps vibe to them. Cramps, one of my all-time favorite bands, and these guys played with them many times. They were good friends with Poison Ivy and Lux. Yeah. They've lasted all these years. They've had a few lineup changes, but they've persevered, and they've had such. To be honest with you, they were probably one of the bands that I've ever heard of that had so many problems with record labels. Okay, just one record label after another folding.
Yeah, they went
as soon as they would sign them. Yeah. And that's part of the reason probably why they never quite made it. When they were on IRS, that label, that was when they had a shot. But anyway, we want to get into it.
Yeah, that's good. Because the first label was Red Star Records, and that went under quick.
Yeah, well, that was Marty Thau's label. Okay, now the Fleshtones were formed in, like I said, 1976 in Whitestone, Queens. Okay, Whitestone is a nice, quiet little neighborhood under the Whitestone Bridge in northern Queens. The band was started by Keith Streng, who's a New York City native guy, and also Jan Marek Pakulski. Okay, now he was originally from Lewiston, Maine. These two guys were roommates, and they rented a house.
It's totally Polish.
Oh, you couldn't get any more. I figured he was from Greenpoint, but he was from Maine. But yeah, So these two guys were roommates, and they rented a house in Whitestone, and which in those days was probably very cheap to do. And they happened to discover in the basement there was some instruments down there left by somebody who was a prior tenant or something. Okay. And there was a guitar, there was a bass. All right. And nothing fancy, but these were good instruments. And Streng, who could play a little guitar, started playing the guitar that they found. And Pakulski played the bass. And they wanted to start a band. They decided to start a band because they were interested in what was going on down on the Lower East Side at CBGB's in those days. The Ramones, Blondie, Television, all those bands they were into. And they said, we love rock and roll. And, we can't play like Led Zeppelin, but we might be able to play like the Ramones. So let's start a band. Okay.
Start a band.
Yeah. Now, they were soon joined by two guys in the neighborhood, Pete Zaremba, who was on vocals. He could play keyboards and harmonica. He plays a wicked harmonica. Okay. And Lenny Calderon was on drums. Two neighborhood guys that they knew, and they kind of just took them in to start this band. Now, after several practices and they started playing house parties, the Fleshtones decided, well, now it's time to play CBGB's. So on May 19th, 1976, which is interesting because May 19th is Joey Ramone's birthday. Okay. Yeah. They still celebrate it even now at clubs. The band became a regular act at CBGB's after this. They started off on an audition night. Hilly Crystal, the owner, said, okay, we'll give you like the third slot on a Monday night. They didn't get like a headlining, but they started to become a regular. And but the strange thing is they never really fit in. Another band that never really fit in but was playing around in those days was the Cramps. They were kind of not taken seriously. And I think the Fleshtones kind of fell into that category. They were mostly New York guys.
Yeah, definitely New York guys.
Yeah, and the Cramps really weren't, but they were living here for a while. And they just, they didn't fit in with that Legs McNeil punk rock magazine, the Please Kill Me book, kind of clique. Nothing wrong with them. I mean, that was really the hugest part about CB's in those days. But the Fleshtones were one of these acts that if you go back and you look at old flyers, old handbills that were written up, they're on like every fucking gig. They're like everywhere. Yeah, they're everywhere. Like opening for the Ramones, opening for Blondie, third on the bill or something. You know what I mean? Opening for Television, playing with the Cramps eventually. It's like, wow, these guys always are out there,
They were with so many groups. It was incredible.
Yeah. Now, after, like I said, they weren't really accepted. So what they kind of did is they decided to branch out a little bit and play Max's Kansas City as well. Now, in those days, there was a bit of a rivalry between the two clubs, Max's Kansas City and CB's. There weren't too many bands that played both. And if they did, they generally played one a lot more than the other. Yeah. The Ramones will always be known as the CBGB's band. Television, CBGB's band. But they did play Max's at times. But the Fleshtones kind of really played both places. They really were one of the few that played pretty much equally, maybe sometimes even more at Max's, because they ended up, what they liked about Max's is the people would actually dance, a little bit. Okay. And they thought of themselves as kind of this 60s garage rock, even a little bit of an injection of soul music, into their sound. After their maybe first or second year, they kind of did that. They were big soul music fans. I mean, I know that when Zaremba, was at home or they would do house parties, there would be soul music playing, things like that. He liked a lot of that stuff. And actually, just as a side note, he's on Little Steven's Underground Garage channel on Sirius. He has his own show, Pete Zaremba.
Dude, do you remember that club 57?
Club 57 on St. Mark's. Yeah, very vaguely. I don't think I was ever in there. Were you?
No, but it's like a halfway house now.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah. It's like 57 St. Mark's, right?
Yeah, it's like some kind of halfway house now. Cause
Yeah.
I walk by it every day, and when I was reading that about Club 57, I was like, Jesus Christ, man, how long was that?
Well, you had Club 82 also over there.
Mm-hmm. But that was on another block.
That was on the next block, yeah.
Yeah.
57 is on the north side of the street there, close to 2nd Avenue, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, wow, man, when I would see that, because if a lot of people remember, there used to be Coney Island High.
Coney Island High came later, but that was at St. Mark's, closer to 3rd Avenue, between 2nd and 3rd. But I mean, look, in these days, in the 70s, the 80s, even into the early 90s, there were lots of these like little places.
Yeah,
definitely. You have a stage, it could hold 200 people in there or something, and that's it, or even less. Yeah. So, they started kind of playing Max's, CB's, both places, and by being regulars at both of these clubs, it goes back to what I was saying before. They really got on a lot of cool bills. Okay, they played in a lot of gigs. You can go back and look at old flyers of Max's and CBGB's, and they played with a lot of popular bands, underground bands at the time. Now, by 1978, the Fleshtones were regularly on stage with a combo called the Action Combo. It was two brothers, Gordon and Brian Spaeth. And Gordon played alto sax, and Brian played harmonica. Okay. So this kind of gave the band a fuller sound. They could get that soul sound that they wanted a little bit at times. And at the same time, they were becoming known as like the ultimate party band. All right. Wherever they played, like you never quite knew what would happen on stage. All right. And in the show. Yeah, they were exciting. They were quirky in a Crampsy, even I'm even going to go so far to say is quirky almost in a B-52s kind of way.
Yeah.
Okay. Not as corny, but definitely like whatever little bit of pop influence they had kind of went in that direction. But Club 57, as you mentioned, on St. Mark's was a spot they played a lot. Irving Plaza, when they were opening for bands, they played there. Danceteria, exactly, yeah. And a lot of other venues. Now, when Maxwell's opened,
I think Maxwell's still there.
I think it's not. I think it's gone. I haven't been there in about 15 years. I think it's gone.
I think it's just not in Hoboken. I think it's still in Maxwell, but I think it's somewhere else in New Jersey.
I gotta look that up. I saw a lot of great bands at Maxwell's. Maxwell's was a spot that I would go to every couple of months just for the hell of it, even if nobody I knew was playing, because it was good to kind of like get out of the city for a night,
So I got a little history. So Maxwell closed on July 31st, 2013.
Yeah,
and reopened
that was 8 years ago. Yeah.
Opened as Maxwell Tavern under new management. Less than 4 years later, they closed again.
Yeah. I think it became just a bar maybe, and they didn't have bands anymore.
Yeah, that's when it became a bar.
Yeah. Yeah. If you remember, Continental did that too. They stopped having bands for quite a few years and then just closed. Maxwell's, when it opened, I think, in the 70s, late 70s, They one of the first bands I think ever played was the Fleshtones. They were asked to play Maxwell's a lot, and I seen them there actually at Maxwell's too. Now they also would even go so far as play the 930 Club in Washington D.C. They went down there a lot. They were popular there. In '77, the Fleshtones started sharing a rehearsal space with the Cramps. They became good friends with them. Miriam Linna, who was the ex-drummer to the Cramps, she was in the A-Bones. She started Norton Records. Miriam is an amazing person. She's done so much for underground music. It's amazing. she was an early fan of the Fleshtones and kind of did what she could, to push them along. And they all became good friends. Now, you mentioned Red Star Records, and that was Marty Thau's label. Marty Thau was the ex-New York Dolls manager who started this band, and he signed acts like Suicide, to his label, and the Fleshtones, several others. They recorded an album right away, but it got kind of shelved and didn't come out. But after about a year, 1979 or so, they released a single off it called American Beat, and that was the first Fleshtones single ever. Also at that time, there was a filmmaker named M. Henry Jones. He was an underground filmmaker. He did this kind of like partially animated, partially live video clips of them, and it was called Soul City. And it was kind of interesting. It's almost like I don't know what you call this kind of filmmaking, but it's like cutouts, And
it's almost like Take On Me, but it was a lot different.
Not drawn. That was more drawn. This is more like they filmed it, and they used film, but they used special light exposure on them, and it gave them like a green background or whatever, and then they would cut out their figures and place them kind of, and then also color them differently, so they looked almost cartoonish.
Yeah, that was very good, but I still think that's where I got the idea from.
Maybe. I mean, whatever you think of that song is one thing, but the video is cool. Yeah, the video is cool.
The video cool, but I think that was pretty much the first time you saw that thing, like animation like that
in a rock video,
and that probably gave inspiration to a lot of video, even Sledgehammer, all that stuff later on that came out. That was
right. Sledgehammer was like all stop motion action, Yeah. I mean, in the 80s, there was some cool, videos, even despite the song sucking, but sometimes the video was cool. Sledgehammer, I can't listen to that shit, man. I'm sorry, man. But, But anyway, so in 1980, Red Star Records, who had signed the Fleshtones, the Suicide, Alan Vega's band, the Real Kids from Boston, they were having financial issues with this label, and they still had not released the Fleshtones album. It still was held back. So what would happen eventually is Raw Records, or Reach Out International Records, would eventually release it as an album called Blast Off. And in those days, in 80, Raw Records was cassette only. Do you remember them?
Yeah, I remember that.
Remember Tower Records used to have the Raw Records rack?
Yeah,
and they were always underground music and stuff. I used to buy a lot from that. I still have a handful of cassettes from that rack. But it was called Blast Off, and it was released on cassette, and then a few years later it came out on CD and eventually even vinyl.
Yeah.
But the band at that point now was really without a label, which was a situation they would find themselves in a lot. But there was a lot of buzz around the Fleshtones, and Miles Copeland from IRS Records would soon sign them, and they would soon work with producers Richard Mazda and Richard Goddard. Richard Goddard from the Strangeloves, the 60s band. It was also at this time that drummer Lenny Calderon decided to leave the band, and he got replaced by a guy named Bill Millhiser. Now, they would make an appearance in the British punk new wave film Erg, A Music War, all right?
Yep.
And very cool movie that was featured a lot of punk, new wave acts of the time. The Cramps are on it. Joan Jett is on it.
They had a little bit of everywhere. It was a who's of music.
Yeah, X is part of it, the Los Angeles punk band. Devo is on it, the Dead Kennedys. And I think, if I remember right, a very early appearance of the Go-Go's, I think, are on it too. Now, and they also released from that record label, IRS, an EP called Up Front, and that came out in 1980. and 4 albums would follow. Now this would be their kind of their peak, okay, where they really had a chance to make it. Never quite happened. But these 4 albums were an album called Roman Gods that came out in 82, an album called Hexbreaker, which is one of my personal favorites, that came out in 83. And then they came out, interestingly, with 2 live albums back-to-back in 85, Speed Connection and Speed Connection 2. Okay? And in 82...
Those were very good albums.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you're going to buy anything by the Fleshtones, you want those 4. Okay? Yeah. I think it pretty much encompasses what they're about. But then again, I did hear part of their album from last year, and I'll go into that at the end, and it's not bad. I hadn't heard it, and just in doing the research on the show, I listened to some of it. It's pretty good. In 82, they appeared on American Bandstand with Dick Clark, and in 84, they re-recorded American Beat, and it was part of the Bachelor Party soundtrack, the Tom Hanks movie. Remember that movie?
Yeah, that was a great movie, yeah.
Yeah. There's a funny story where the band was invited to the premiere of that movie, and they went, and I think it was like 2 guys like fell asleep during the show. And one of them, like the guy, like Tom Hanks, was sitting behind him. And so, well, Bachelor Party's not a great movie, man. It's like, you know, just typical 80s cheesy comedy, you know. But that was at a time when Hanks was big on bosom buddies and all that, remember?
Yeah.
You know? So the IRS years, like I said, are considered the peak time for that band. But it was really also their most commercial.
They also, for them to be on American Bandstand, they made like a little splash. You weren't just invited to American Bandstand.
No. The IRS was run by Miles Copeland. Miles Copeland was the brother of Stuart Copeland from the Police. Okay, so he had a lot of pull, especially in the early '80s when his brother was doing very well on the charts. So it was kind of like, you know, they'd help each other out. A lot of IRS bands that really probably, if they'd been on other labels, wouldn't have gone anywhere. You know, they actually had a little bit about them because of just being on that Copeland run, you know, label. So Roman Gods, that album, when it came out, it debuted at 174 on the Billboard charts, which gave them a little bit of a buzz. It would be their highest chart position until 2020, when that new album had come out. Pete Zaremba,
that's pretty incredible.
Yeah,
you know, many years later, then.
Well, you know why? It goes to show how rock and roll is really not in the public conscience. So if something does come out, it's kind of like it can be a bigger deal in a way, because they're on these charts that there aren't that many acts like that anymore. Not to take away from the Fleshtones. I mean, they deserve it. You know, I think they debuted at 9 or something like that on that new album. Wow. But the highest they had done in the height of if you think about all the new wave bands, punk bands that they were kind of competing with at the time in the early 80s, it you know, to get at 174 was kind of an accomplishment, I would say. So Zaremba, actually, I don't know if you remember this. He hosted something called IRS Records Presents The Cutting Edge. This was a show on MTV that was on for a couple of years. I remember it. It was kind of like a precursor to 120 Minutes.
That's pretty much what it was.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you. If my memory serves me right, I would say it was better than 120 Minutes, because they played obviously the IRS bands, and there was a lot of decent bands on that label. A lot of them, you know, had videos, and MTV didn't really play them. Okay, but when this show was on, they would get played. But they also promoted other bands, and it was a little bit of like the show, a little in the title, a Cutting Edge, where 120 Minutes kind of got like a little light, you know. But eventually, but Cutting Edge Zaremba hosted this. It was all up and coming artists at the time.
That's what it was, and it was on Sunday night, just like 120 minutes.
It might have been. It might have been, right? It was on late, I think.
Yeah, it was late. It was like 10 o'clock,
maybe midnight.
11 o'clock.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Late shows.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
It was about the same as it was pretty much 120 minutes before there was 120 minutes.
Yeah,
and then we saw a lot of new band or breakout artists or people to watch. Same format, pretty much. They just changed the name.
Exactly. Pete Zaremba, because of his, hosting this show in the 90s, he could continue on hosting other things. And there was something you might remember in the New York City underground live scene. There was the Cave Stomp shows.
Yeah.
Okay, the Cave Stomp garage rock shows. Now I was very into this, and he used to MC some of these shows, and it was very cool. Okay, because he's a funny guy. He's got a great sense of humor, but he's very knowledgeable. And I don't know how much he was involved with booking the bands, but the Cave Stomp shows had the most amazing shit. You'd have like old 60s garage rock bands mixed in with new bands. So it was very cool. They would play, God, there was wherever they could. There was clubs on the west side, clubs on the east side. They played, it was everywhere. Now,
like a weird kind of festival. Then I think it turned into that. It turned into that CD something. They called it something else later on. But CMJ. You thinking of? Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's what the evolution started with. These they were Cave, and then when they stopped
CMJ was a national thing. Okay, CMJ was like you'd have the CMJ week, and it would be a highlight of underground bands, but it was going on in other cities as well. Cave Stomp was like strictly in New York. But yeah, I mean, it was the idea of promoting underground bands. So in that sense, you're right.
They would go all over the place. They would be different. It was just like the CJs. Like they would go everywhere else also. Like you would go 1 week, you go to like this venue. Then the following day there was another band, and it's pretty much the same format.
It was like the SantaCon of underground music. He went to different places.
Different places.
Yeah, you're right. And not every club welcomed the CMJ, but if you did, I think you got, there was perks to do it, I think. And there would be a lot of journalists would be following them around to write about music and, write about these bands. But anyway, by the mid 80s, IRS would go out of business. They would start to have financial problems too.
That's crazy.
And the Fleshtones would find themselves without a label again. Now, at this point, the band was kind of regularly playing the Pyramid Lounge over on Avenue A.
Yeah.
And they were also very instrumental in starting Wigstock.
Yep.
The very first Wigstock. And Wigstock in New York City was a annual event for a lot of years. They had to be close to 20 years they did this, right?
Yeah.
I think.
I think we try to do it again, but it hasn't been like the original one, Like
it's not as
it's not as I don't know, it's not as good.
Yeah, well, Wigstock was promoted underground bands, but it was also a lot of like drag queens and it was like everybody you'd see at the Mermaid Parade kind of thing.
Yes,
things like that. And I went to a couple of them because there was some good bands playing. They would have Wigstock. I think I'm trying to remember now. Where was it? They had it in Union Square one time, right? Oh, more than once.
By the piers, like some of the
by the piers.
And it was the thing that you would go Wigstock.
I think one time they had it in Brooklyn too. It was like different places. Every year they would do a different place. But now, even without a label, the band kept on touring in America and Europe, especially because in Europe they were like very big. Some shows in those years included bills with Chuck Berry, James Brown, and in 1987, they were featured on the very last episode of Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes on MTV, which was the seed for what became 120 Minutes. Okay. Right after that was when they started with the 120-minute show. In 87, they were asked to record the title track for the campy horror movie, I Was a Teenage Zombie. Okay.
That's a great movie.
It is a great movie. It's just about these teenage kids in high school. And, there's like, one guy gets thrown into the Hudson River. And the Hudson River is supposedly so polluted, it's turning people into zombies. And a guy comes out, he's all green, he's like killing people and shit.
It's
people.
great. It's great.
Yeah.
It's so
and
cheesy.
then,
It's so bad that it's great.
Well, the first guy to go in the river is like the local drug dealer. He's like this Puerto Rican guy with like a big hat, right? And he's got like a vest on and everything. And he falls and he comes out, he's all green. He's got a big he has like a Juan Epstein fro under his hat and a big mustache.
It's fucking great. It's great. It's so cheesy. So campy,
it is. I
so
have
good.
that. I have that movie somewhere. I do have that movie. I own it. Now that movie, it didn't really go anywhere, but they did do the soundtrack to it. So they released a final studio album on IRS in 1987 called Fleshtones vs. Reality. And then they released also a live album in 89 called Soul Madrid. And their final release on IRS would be a compilation best of called Living Legends. And that came out in 89. Original member and bass player Pakulski decided to leave the band. Now, this was in late 86, and he got replaced by Robert Burke Warren until 1988, when he would leave and get replaced. I'm sorry, in 88 he would leave, and then between 88 and 90, they would have kind of like a revolving door of bass players. They had Fred Smith, formerly of Television, Andy Chernoff from the Dictators. The Dictators and the Fleshtones were very good friends. Handsome Dick Manitoba has always called them the ultimate party band. He had them play one of their later record release. When they were releasing an album, they had a record release party at Manitoba's. That was like about maybe 10 years ago, something like that. He's always promoted them very, very highly. Now, in 1990, Toronto native Ken Fox was brought in on bass. And Pete Zaremba loves this guy. Okay, he loves that he's in the band. He credits him for giving the band the stamina to continue on. He's a younger guy. Okay, he's a few years younger than them. And basically he says that, it's his enthusiasm to play that keeps the band going. Okay, especially with the live show. Yeah. So in 1992, the Fleshtones signed with Ichiban Records. Okay, and that lasted about 4 years until Ichiban would go down as well. Okay,
it's amazing how many of these record labels go down. It's amazing.
Well, sometimes these labels, even if you're doing well, they can't push you like you should be pushed. They just don't have the funds. Through independent labels, it's difficult. So it was during the time with Ichiban that they recorded the albums with Dave Faulkner of the Hoodoo Gurus. Peter Buck from R.E.M. produced an album for them. Steve Albini from Big Black, he produced an album for them. These were called...
They have very good producers. Very good.
Yeah, I mean, Power Stance, Beautiful Light, and Laboratory of Sound. These were the ones recorded by those guys.
Wow.
They were always very well respected as a band. Other bands liked them. They liked to play with them. They were cool. So it was natural that people would be, happy to produce a record. REM's Peter Buck was always kind of a cool guy. He'd have his ear to what was going on in the underground scene, Yeah, so definitely. At the turn of the century, the Fleshtones collaborated with musician producers Rick Miller, Jim Diamond from Detroit, Lenny Kaye, formerly the Patti Smith Group, Ivan Julian. Okay. They also self-produced some albums at Paul Johnson's Compactor Basement Studio. That's in Brooklyn. Yeah. Right. They would eventually sign to Yep Rock Records. That would be in 2003. And they've stayed with that label to the present date. Okay, they've been with them for 19 years. It seems to have worked. And really, what it comes down to is the label's founder. His name was Tor Hansen. Before he had the label, he was a fan of the Fleshtones.
Oh, so that's good.
And he always he made a promise to himself that if he ever started a record label, he would sign these guys right away, and he did.
Wow.
And he did. So the Fleshtones were also one of the last bands to ever play at Windows of the World at the World Trade Center.
I didn't even know that. I didn't even realize that until I read
I didn't know about that gig. That was in 2001. I didn't know about that gig, how they got that. But Windows of the World occasionally had bands. They did.
Yeah.
It's kind of forgotten, but they did.
I couldn't remember ever seeing a band there. You know, you mostly.
I don't know. I don't think I ever did. I went there to eat a couple of times, but that was they did have
like
bands.
a special event. It might have been something.
Probably was.
They say let's get the Fleshtones. You know.
Probably was. So they also in 2002 after the 9/11 attacks, when there were a lot of memorials and stuff going on, they played the commemoration for 9/11 at CB's called the Night of Remembrance and Hope Festival. Now, the following year, in December of 2003, the band played the 30th anniversary of CBGB's, 1973 to 2003. That was a gig they did with the Dictators, a band they played with quite a bit. In August of 2004, they were part of the Little Stevens Underground Garage Festival on Randall's Island. I remember that very well.
Wow, it was 39 other bands.
40 bands all together, 12-hour show, 13 hours or so. I was standing. Well, I went with George Figueroa. Okay. And the headlining bands that night were the Strokes, the New York Dolls, the Reformed New York Dolls, and then the Reformed Stooges as well, Iggy Pop. Great gig. Now, another guy that was on that gig was Bo Diddley. That was the last time I got to see him.
Wow.
But, the Chesterfield Kings were at that show. Nancy Sinatra played that show, believe it or not. Okay. The Ravenettes, God, like I said, like 40 acts. One of the best shows I ever seen. But just
so this is another who's.
It was a who's who, yeah. And director Christopher Columbus, interestingly, had filmed that show, okay? And it was supposed to come out as a concert movie, but it never did. It just never. I don't know what happened. I have a bootleg of it, okay, of his footage, and I think it's not fully the whole show, but it's a lot of it. It's a good 2-3 hours of it. And
give it to Peter Jackson. He'll fix it.
Peter Jackson should do a documentary on it. Yeah, definitely. So over the next 17 years, they, would release several more albums on Yep Rock. They toured China for the first time. Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible.
And they had a book written about them called Sweat, The Story of the Fleshtones, an American Garage Band. It was written by Joe Bonomo. And in 2009, they released a documentary based on that book, and it's called Pardon Us for Living, But the Graveyard is Full. Okay? The Story of the Fleshtones. Great movie. It's on Amazon Prime for about $5 if you want to buy it. Watch it. It's cheaper to rent it. Great movie, hour-long documentary about the band. In 2020, they recorded their latest studio album called The Face of the Screaming Werewolf, and it debuted at number 9 on Billboard's alternative charts, and that's their highest ever.
Yeah.
Okay. So they are set to be on tour. They did some final shows for 2021. Nothing in the New York area, I don't believe. I believe they played Pennsylvania and a few other places. But they do have a tour scheduled for the spring of 2022. So we will see some Fleshtones around. I'm going to try to catch them again because it was kind of like listening to them again and researching the show. It kind of reminded me how great they were.
And everybody on that group, even now, even with the replacement, half of those guys are original members,
Pretty
half
much.
The band is the original members.
Yeah, pretty much. And Zaremba is really the heart and soul. He's a great front man. You know, they're all good. The musicians are great. You know, it's just a fun show, and you could see them generally in small places, so it's cool.
Mike, you know what's so funny? The newest member was joined the band in 1990.
Look, Ken Fox. Well, Ken Fox was it 1990? Yeah. So he's already with them 30 fucking years already. You know what I mean? Well, it just shows how old they are, you know, and how old we are.
Yeah, I was like, when I looked at it, I said, "Wow,
yeah,
that's a lot of years with the same band, and they still got the original guitarist and the original lead singer." So
yep.
Not a bad show. Bad show.
It's a great writing combination between Streng and him and Zaremba. Yeah. So that's all I got for you today. The Fleshtones, Rob.
Mike, thank you for another wonderful episode of The Rock Show. This is episode 147. And it's 2022, and I'd like to wish everybody a Happy New Year, and a Happy New Year to you, Mike, and all the viewers. Also, so Mike, if they need to reach you or ask you any questions, how can they get to you?
Okay, I'm on all the social media spots. Instagram, I'm RockerMike212, RockerMike212. If you want to find me on Facebook, I'm RockoMike. And also we have the Rock Show podcast group page on Facebook. Check that out. I'm on Clout Hub and MeWe as RockerMike. And pretty soon we're going to jump over to Truth Social when that comes out.
Yeah.
I hope.
That'd be pretty good. And to everybody else, remember, don't get drunk.
Get lumped up.
See you next week.
Take care, people.
Podcast you will hear that will be music to your ears. You'll learn about bands you love or may not know, and it's only here on The Rock Show. Ooh, yeah, on The Rock Show. Ooh, yeah, on The Rock Show. Don't tell your friends and everyone you know. Let's get lumped up on The Rock Show.